This time of year seems to be popular time for parties. End of school parties, graduation parties, and maybe this next one is just me, or maybe it's only a thing for those of us who live in the Midwest, but the thank God summer has finally arrived parties. Similarly, in our readings today, there's a party taking place out in the streets of Jerusalem. People of Jewish descent have come from all over the Roman Empire to gather in the city for the Feast of Weeks, also known as the Feast of Harvest, and better known to us as Pentecost. It's a religious feast, and the purpose of this particular feast is to celebrate the first harvest and to give God thanks for the blessings of food and nourishment. Think of it as being much like our modern-day Thanksgiving, but with far more religious significance. Just like any other religious festival then or now, it's a reason to gather for worship and celebration. Friends who haven't seen each other since last year are catching up. Extended families gather at grandma's house. And the food, oh man, the food! Every restaurant in town is filled to capacity, and there are lines of people just waiting to get in. The markets have all stocked the best meats, fish, vegetables, and fruits in anticipation of all the celebrations that will take place. And not only are the usual street vendors present, but there are plenty of out-of-town visitors who have made the journey to set up their stands of Ethiopian, Greek, Turkish, and other ethnic foods. The party atmosphere in the streets is electric, and the disciples are in a room praying. Before Jesus left them, he told them to wait. So they're waiting. From inside their gathering space, they can hear the voices rising from the street, and they can definitely smell the aroma of delicious foods already getting started on griddles. And yet they remain inside, praying and waiting. I think it would be safe to assume that some of them are even wondering just when this prayer gathering is going to be over, so they can go out and grab a lamb kebab or at least a loaf of bread. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like a rush of violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and the tongues rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability. Pentecost seems to be one of those days in the church year that many Lutheran Christians just don't seem to have any idea what to do with. We know it's one of the few times in the church year that the color in worship is red, and that it has something to do with the Holy Spirit, tongues of fire, and strange languages. But beyond that, we really don't seem to know what to do with it. Not only that, but we also have those who look at us and say that we don't talk enough about the Holy Spirit, that what we believe, teach, and confess is dead, or that we're not alive as some other churches seem to be. It's a day that can bring about what I've heard referred to as Lutheran shame. And as a result, we simply decide it's just easier to not talk about Pentecost or what happened on that day. The followers of Jesus have retreated into hiding after the crucifixion and have been waiting quietly for God to act. The place is as silent as a church on a Monday morning. But the time has come, and with it comes the shattering of the silence. In the terrifying sound of a violent wind, God announces the arrival of the promised gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, to be completely clear, I don't have a clue what the disciples' prayer agenda was, but I'm pretty sure that a frightening sound like a violent rush of wind, tongues of fire, and speaking in different languages wasn't on their list. Regardless, they're driven outward into the streets. The Spirit of God filled them so that they could speak diverse languages, recognized by the multicultural crowd packing the streets of Jerusalem. People in the crowd are baffled to hear people from nearby Galilee talking in languages from all around the Mediterranean. These Galileans, as the text refers to them, speak out in ways that moments before were unfamiliar to them, but somehow now they've suddenly become masters of foreign speech. Yet what happens on this first Christian Pentecost has to do not only with language, but also with content. These Galileans are not making small talk. They're announcing God's latest deeds of power. They're declaring that Jesus, the Messiah, has conquered death. This was the first event in the life of the church. And while it may have begun inside, it quickly moved beyond the walls of that room where the disciples were gathered. The gift of the Holy Spirit turned those who were gathered outward, toward those outside their movement, first to the people gathered in Jerusalem and then to the rest of the world. And if this serves as any kind of metaphor for today's church, then we can't help but see the beauty of it. The Spirit of God gives the gathered community the gifts and the courage to be the scattered community. When we talk about being the church, then we're talking about being a people that are connected to one another and people who serve the needs of one another. Jesus said, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." What would happen if we actually followed Jesus' command and lived this way? What would this do to our church, our relationships, our families, our schools, our workplaces, our communities, or our world? Can you imagine how different things would be if we lived according to this standard? What would it be like if we were truly as concerned about the happiness, problems, successes, and disappointments of others as we are about ourselves? Our love for one another is one of the greatest witnesses to the world, and it backs up everything we claim as followers of Jesus. But sadly, too often we reflect the opposite to those around us. We need to do a better job of understanding that the church is a family. Brothers and sisters bound together in love, caring for one another, helping one another, and serving one another. And just as that first Pentecost was not for the disciples, this Pentecost day is not for us either. The Holy Spirit is calling us to move to the other side of our stained glass safe houses, engage the world, and recognize that the Spirit of God is already active there. We have so much to give and even more to learn if we don't stay tucked away behind closed doors, keeping God's message of love and redemption to ourselves. What we say destroys the confines of language. Words are no longer simply words, cheap and plentiful. They serve their purpose as pointers to the truth. So where would you go? And what would you say if you were filled with the Holy Spirit? And how might those outside of the walls of this church hear God's message and be welcomed? When we dare to claim the truth of our lives and speak with the authority given to us by the Holy Spirit, it's only then that our message of invitation rings loud and clear, shattering language barriers and every other obstacle that separates us from others. When we allow ourselves to be broken open and moved outward by the Holy Spirit, then other people have the opportunity to hear, perhaps for the very first time, how God is alive not only in our lives, but in theirs as well. My friends, this is the movement of the Spirit today. From status quo to openness, from prayer to action, from a small room to a world full of possibility. The mission of the church is to communicate the love of God to a lost and dying world. And the church isn't the church if we stay where we are, refusing to be changed and moved by the insistence of the Holy Spirit. Today, I invite you to not see Pentecost as just another date on the church calendar where the red color of clothing or church banners or flowers are the primary focus of the day. Just as the Father is still for us and Jesus is still with us, so the Spirit is still alive in us and moving among us. So as that mighty wind washes over you, let the Spirit of God whisper in whatever language you need to hear most. And then trust that same Spirit to give you everything you need to speak and live God's words of grace, forgiveness, and love to everyone you encounter. Thanks be to God. Amen.